So this is the first. Is that because I'm the oldest one around?
No, because you live 10 minutes away from us.
Okay, so sheer convenience, good. Okay,
And
so
because we love you.
thank you. Okay, so let's do an opening treatment for this most auspicious occasion. So here we are, the Holy Trinity. Spirit, soul, body, the whole creative idea of universal oneness and allness personified through this activity, which transcends time and space and yet remains accomplished and expressed in time and space. Surely this is demonstration of the action of God taking its individualized, specialized expression through each and every one present individually and all of us collectively. So I know that everything moves smoothly, for that is the nature of God as all. I know that originating intelligence is guiding and inspiring this entire activity, for that is the nature of God in action. And I know that everything works together with joy, with wisdom, with clarity, and with the love of selfless service, which is exhibited right here and right now by those implementing this inspired idea for all posterity. So I give thanks and I bless each and every one. I bless the organization, the Science of Mind Archives Library. I know that everything truly is an uplifting and enlightened divine ideal which now comes into fruition day by day in every way. The greater is revealed as that which each one is and all are. For this and so much more than words can express, I give thanks. Letting mind take care of the details. Gratefully, I let it be, and so it is.
And so it is. Dr. Sue Rubin, we are so grateful to be able to have this opportunity to interview you and record this for the Science of Mind Archives and Library to capture your history and your wisdom. And so I'd like to just start with asking you to tell us a little bit about your life and where you were born and a little bit about the circumstances of your growing up.
Okay, so we're going to be here for a few days, but not to worry. Actually, today is really quite unusual because today, August 28th, 2014, my brother was killed 70 years ago on this very day in southern France during World War II.
Wow.
And a whole series of events have surfaced that have made that even more visible and dynamic in its creative expression. So I was upstairs before talking to his picture. 70 years, and I mean,
Wow.
I just had to thank God I'm here to say that, you know.
It's
It's
amazing.
remarkable. So we were born, my brother and I, in New York City, and in the heart of Upper Midtown, and in and of the Jewish tradition, although we really were more cultural Jews, as the saying goes, than observers. And yet I have an uncle, a great uncle, who was a very renowned scholar and author and teacher, who lived 3 streets away from us. So by obligation, we were involved more than we ever thought we wanted to be. And so that was my Uncle Louis. And I feel more and more as time goes by that that exposure through Judaism, which really honestly didn't connect for me at that time, but through that seed that was planted, it somehow was already something that was going to germinate and to gestate and give rise to my own particular path. Time went on, I got married at 21, graduated before, in fact they coincided. I graduated from New York University when I was 21.
I went to school there too.
You did?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Not for undergrad though, but
Right.
how wonderful.
Yeah, exactly.
What were you studying there?
I started wanting to be an elementary school teacher. And then by the time I was called upon in the final year to do student teaching, I didn't like it. I didn't want to do that. And so I finished up with liberal arts and got a BS. To this day, I don't know how the heck I got a BS, but I'll take it. And so a lot of things coalesced at that period. My mom had been sick for many, many years, and I was engaged, had just graduated, and we had set the wedding very quickly because we wanted my mom to be around. By this time, I have to fast forward and then back up. My brother had been killed in 1944, and so we set the date for the wedding, and my mom passed away before that ever happened. And so we kept that date, though. We got married in February of the next year of 45. No, it was 40, I was married in 49, because I had known my ex for a long time. Imagine, 1949, what were you guys doing then? You were probably in diapers.
Not born yet.
Oh, jeez, not even. So time marched on. I had my first son according to schedule, because in my generation it was like you got married, you waited a couple of years, then you had your first child, waited a couple of years, probably about 3 or 4, had your second child. So I did it right on schedule, and I had my son, Michael, and then 4 years later I had my daughter, Sandy. And then my husband at the time had itchy feet. He wanted to move to the West Coast, and he was a salesman who could really do what he was doing anywhere. So we moved to Southern California for the first time in 1955, and I did not like it. I missed the hustle, the bustle, people on the street, activity. Everybody was like in their homes or in their cars, and I was lonely and very unhappy. So, being the good-natured fella he was, we picked up, we moved back to New York in 56, came back to California in 57 because I didn't like it once I got back there. A lesson in metaphysics, you know, the grass is always perhaps a little bit greener when we're thinking we're really missing something. So that was it. That was the final move. In 58, we lived first in around Highland and Olympic in an apartment, and stayed there for a while, and then bought our first home, a tract home in way out at that time, Granada Hills. And so that was my first taste of suburbia. Still, no signs of mine, nothing of the sort, no religion, no tradition, no faith, no examination. It all just came to an end, because by that time my dad had died, my mom was gone, my brother was gone. It was like, where is God in this picture? Apparently not.
So, in addition to your brother's death, what were some other very impactful experiences that you had before you came to Science of Mind? Things that really kind of shifted your perspective?
I realized that I had problems emotionally, that I was not encouraged as a kid to express my feelings. Therefore, I became very adept at repressing them, even as I can relate at each time someone died. When my brother died, we never came together, my mom and dad and I. We each kind of retreated literally into our own bedrooms and grieved in our own way. And my father became very angry at God. And so it was almost as if that was a forbidden word. So it was the realization that something in me was off kilter. I was not happy. I guess today you would say perhaps I was in occasional spouts of depression, and then quick to anger. Imagine me, quick to anger, yes. And so I thought, I can do something about this. I can go to a counselor and talk it out. And I did. And with a wonderful marriage and family counselor in the Valley at that time. So he was not much of a talker. He kept encouraging me to get to the heart of what I was thinking and feeling. And the other thing that dovetailed, at that time, transcendental meditation was being popularized in the West. And so the Maharishi was coming and talking about the calming, quieting effects, and they had centers now set up where you could get the training. So I took the TM training. So take psychology, take the technique, one technique of meditation, put it together. And then everything came to a time marched on. In other words, I didn't work. I was a stay-at-home mom. Fast forward 19 years, one bright day, although I knew there were problems, my husband said he was leaving me. And so it was like, you can't do that. I'm the one that makes all the moves, you know, if something like that were to happen. And so he did. He said, I want a divorce. We went into counseling with my therapist for a while, but it didn't work. Then, of course, I did what any red-blooded Jewish girl, like my generation, raised in New York, would do to save the marriage. I got pregnant with my third. And so that was a cause of simply procrastinating the inevitable. We did that for 2 years, and then when John, my third, was 2 years old, my ex left. And then, so you take the counseling, you take the meditation, you take a more stable approach to life. And a friend of mine who kept saying, you gotta come with me to this Church of Religious Science in Glendale. She was Jewish, so I figured, well, maybe it's not so bad. And that's where I discovered Dr. Leo Fishbeck, who at that time was the minister in Glendale.
What year was that? Do you remember?
That would have been in the late 60s or early 70s, yeah, just about the early 70s. And I liked it because Leo, for me, had a very psychological approach. And fresh out of therapy, it worked for me. So for a while, I kept going to Glendale, but only on a Sunday, until I discovered Dr. Kathy McLaughlin and the Church of Religious Science in Granada Hills, which is where I was. So she had classes, and that's when I started taking, not the Science of Mind classes, but just like a couple of isolated. I saw Raymond Charles Barker. He came out to do he was retired by that time. He did a prosperity workshop that I attended. And then I got tired traveling occasionally to Glendale, and then I decided to sell my home in Granada Hills, and I moved to Reseda. And they told me this new minister, Dr. Tom Johnson, had just come to the West Valley from New York, New Jersey, and I should go check it out. I did. That was it. So that would have been 70, by that time, 75.
So he was really your first main teacher?
Yes, he was, yeah.
And you took all your Science
All
of
my
Mind
classes. He taught 1, I took it, 2, 3, at that time, that's how we refer to it. But when I was ready to continue, not because I thought I wanted to do ministry, but because I needed to continue and keep that pace going, he wasn't teaching it. He didn't have a large enough class. And so Leo Fishbeck was teaching it. So I traveled to Glendale to take the 4th year ministerial with Leo. And then that following year, Tom did have a large enough class, so I took it again with him.
So you became a practitioner, and you went pretty quickly through.
That's boom, boom, boom. You know, the process, we didn't have qualifying exams or oral panels at that time. If your minister thought you filled the bill, you were done, and that was it.
So it was a 1-year training then for ministerial? And a 1-year
no, it extended a little longer. Yeah, but we would carry over a couple of months just because we never really finished the work. And the final, without qualifying test or anything, at that time all you had to do was write a 5,000-word thesis on any topic you wanted. But because I had done it with Leo, I didn't have to do it again. And I remember, of all things, I chose logotherapy. To this day, it's like, I wonder why. I guess the word was very important to me.
Can you explain a little bit more what that is?
Well, logotherapy is this deep penetration into the power of the word. And I guess it always equated with me. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And just the whole history of it, I couldn't tell you a thing about, but the hammering away of the importance of speaking the Word, not in a way of fear and anger and ignorance, but in a more enlightened, spiritually uplifting way, was really important. Carol Nielsen, Reverend Carol Nielsen was in my class with Tom Johnson that's the year that I took it. I offhand don't remember anybody else who went on from that class to do ministry. And meanwhile, Tom was great. He just kept moving me forward. You got to do something with this. This is not a joke. And so I was on the board. He gave me speaking opportunities and teaching opportunities, leadership spots, and just kept prodding. Well, when are you going to make a move? Put your name on the candidate list. So I said, I can't do that. Number one, I've got my youngest at home. By this time, Michael and Sandy were out of the house on their own. John was at home. He was like 17. I was both working in business and involved personally with a wonderful guy. So I had business and I had the pleasure of a relationship. And my dad at that time, he had, the time maybe not in its proper sequence, he had not passed away yet. He had moved to California because his second wife had died. So I had my dad, he was in a nursing home, but I had all of that. Boom, my dad died because I told Tom I can't do it. I've got all these responsibilities. My dad died. The relationship and the business blew up, and my son said, go. You know, I'll be a good kid. Marijuana, smoking, pot, parties. Go, Mom, go. Wherever that
Let's
is.
see, was that the late 70s?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it was already in the 80s.
Okay.
We're in the 80s now. So I put my name in with Dr. Frank Richelieu. He was in charge of placement at that time. And he said, you know, we've got nothing at all other than a New Thought group that wants to affiliate with us. Would you like to candidate there? I went, where would that be? He said, Edmonton. And I went, where is that, Frank? Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And how people continue to play in your life. My friend Bobby, who had introduced me and taken me to Glendale, she was the one who, amidst all of my objections, brought the Jewish practical spirituality to it. She said, they're paying your way to get candidate. What have you got to lose? Just go. You've never been there. Do it. So I did it. I arrived in Edmonton, and that was over a Labor Day weekend. Just like we're coming into the Labor Day weekend now. It was Labor Day weekend. And I spoke, and the group was very gracious. The group that had decided to affiliate, a really great bunch of people. And they interviewed, you know, the whole thing before the congregation. There were just about 30 or 40 of them, maybe 50. And wonderful weekend. Got on a plane to go home, and sitting in that seat, I heard this voice within me saying, you know, you're going there. You want to, and you will go. So I thought about it, and I thought, yeah, that is true. I got home, and at that time, another piece of connecting the dots, Dr. Heather Clark from the Capistrano Valley Center for Spiritual Living, she was the president of the board. She was part of that original group.
In Edmonton.
In Edmonton. And so she called, and she said, we'd like to, just when I got off the plane, dropped my luggage, got into my house, opened the door, phone rings, it's Heather. We'd like to invite you, Reverend Sue, I wasn't a reverend then, Sue, we'd like to invite you to come and be our minister. And I said, I'll have to think about it. Immediate fear, mull it over, push it through all those yeah buts. So I said, I'll call you back in a couple of days. And I did. I said, yeah. And so they said, could you come really fast because we'd like to get it going? And that was September. I said, sure, I'll be there October 1st. No immigration papers, nothing. That's a whole other story. How I arrived, my daughter drove up with me. Said goodbye to my son, I'll send you all the bills, you'll take care of everything. Keep the house neat, don't do anything crazy. Goodbye Michael, goodbye Sandy, bye Johnny. Ask me why I'm doing this, I don't have a clue.
Did you feel something within you, though, that was really calling you?
Yes,
at that
completely. It was a choiceless choice. There was something about it for the first time in my life that it was not a negotiable item. It was simply an imperative that transcended anything that I had ever experienced up to that point. So then, of course, there's a whole other saga. They wouldn't let me into the country because the church was not yet a church, and I was not yet a minister. So they finally gave me permission to stay in Canada for 10 days, provided I'd leave. I had my U-Haul with all my stuff. Provided I'd leave everything on the U.S. side until I could go before a court. So I said, well, good, when can I do that? And they said, it's a traveling adjudicator. You'll have to stay in the States for 10 days until he comes around the circuit. So I talked that one Sunday, the first Sunday, we had agreed upon in October, and then I had to leave. And they were very busy and wonderful. They hired an attorney. And a couple of them, I was in Shelby, Montana, is where I holed up for 10 days, across the border. And they came down, they took me to dinner one night from Edmonton. It's like crazy. And we went before the adjudicator, and he granted me conditional approval. But every year it had to be revisited and reassessed and evaluated whether I could stay. So meanwhile, that was it. Somebody had, from the congregation, or from that group, had agreed to sublease their apartment. They were snowbirds, so they were bound for Palm Springs. So I sublet this gorgeous apartment overlooking the river valley. That was just beautiful. And that's where it was for that whole winter, and then I got my little apartment furnished. Never brought anything but my clothes with me. Left all the, because my son had a party at the house. No, wow. He was great. He was great. So that was it. And the group did have the 50 members to charter. We worked so fast. That was October. Got back the middle of October. In December, Tom Johnson was on his way up to install me and to provide the charter for the church. Freezing. That man, I will never forget, he got off the plane in Edmonton in December. He was so loaded with clothes and hats and scarves and gloves that he could barely walk. It was cold, baby, it was cold.
So it really was a short amount of time
Quick.
Between the time you arrived there and you became a minister and got the charter for the church. And at what point did you become ordained?
That was 3 years later. That also was not the process that everybody goes through now. 3 years, if you were still in the pulpit and nobody was writing a letter of complaint and you were behaving yourself and it looked like things were working, you were ordained in 88. This all happened in 85, December of 85. Tom came back again in 88 and ordained me with my boys. Sandy couldn't make it, but my boys came up for the ordination. Yeah, pretty amazing. My sons put the robe with stole on and all. Yeah, so that was it. We had, by that time we'd moved to a couple of other places. We were renting, but we were looking for our own building. And then bingo, like in 89 or 90, we found a Catholic church that was vacant because they were condensing parishes. And my God, we must have paid, maybe we paid $500,000 for the building that Dr. Patrick Cameron still occupies up there with many improvements and expansion. But yeah, we moved into the church the pews and the confessionals and the baptismal, so we cleaned it all up to the best of our ability. Meanwhile, Heather, Dr. Heather Clark, not only the president of the board, music director in classes. We had started classes immediately and kept going. 1 year, 2 year, 3 trained practitioners. I had probably about 6 or 7 practitioners that very first go around. It's so interesting. A couple, Arnie and Gerd Paulson, and then a mother and a daughter, Jill and June Fodchik. Because when families came, they kind of all went through it together. It was really fabulous. We bought the building, and we got to the point, that growth factor. We were the very first science of mind teaching religious institution in town. They had one other New Thought Center, the Living Enrichment Center, which is still in Edmonton. It's operated by Bob and Jackie Darby. They're still there. But Science of Mind was just like completely new, subject to scrutiny. I was approached by a small Scientology group up there who said, look, they don't really like you, they don't like me. Why don't we get together? Why don't we, come into some kind of a unity? No thanks. I did my first gay marriage. That was like wild, because the photographers from the papers were there, and the young fellows who were getting married, and I don't think about these things too much. It's just like, that's fine. But the kids, the 2 guys, put me with the cameras on me. They were like blank faces. So therefore, big headlines, minister of some cult performs gay wedding. And of course, there were some people that left the center.
What year was that?
Oh, that had to be, again, early 90s. Maybe late 80s.
So you were paving the way there.
Something.
How many years were you in Edmonton?
10 years.
And, so from the time you started studying Science of Mind with Tom Johnson and a little bit before that with Leo Fishbeck, through that time, what were some of the ways Science of Mind changed your life, that you felt it really transformed you personally?
The way that it has personally transformed me is in the complete reshaping of the emotional dynamics of my being, because truly, I could go off on tangents in my life, emotional highs and lows, and quick to, if I wasn't being overtly angry, there was an element of sarcasm and defend, attack. You talk to my first board, they'll tell you that. Talk to the subsequent boards. Talk to people who know me, that there's that something that can rise up. And those emotional peaks and valleys were very much stabilized. Thank God. I didn't have to demonstrate a life-threatening disease in order to prove the principle. I felt that by the continuing deepening of this personal relationship, I could change my relationship with myself and with everyone around me to do things I would never have dreamed doing, because the bottom line is, I wasn't a kid when all this started. I was 57 when I headed up to Edmonton in my little Toyota. And so it was like believing somehow beyond what I had believed, that there is a reason for me. I'm not just the Jewish girl from New York who's supposed to get married, have the kids, be a stay-at-home wife, look nice for your husband when you go out, be decent, help out, do some charity work, something. And maybe it was that first illogical thrust of being in Edmonton. There's more to it. You're here for a greater purpose. There's something in you that wants expression. And I think, without consciously and knowingly doing it, I kept testing the waters of my own possibility. So, sure, I've had my ups and downs physically, and yet I always remember Dr. Robert Bitzer, who I think is still one of the great absolute, you don't deviate from divine principle teachers. And he would always, when he was talking to ministers at conferences, he would say, you know, it's great that you get cancer and you get heart failure and get all these things, and through the power of prayer, you heal yourself of that affliction. And he would say, I have news for you, you don't have to do that. If you would maintain a steady, conscious awareness of your relationship with the infinite and feel that presence at the same time as a loving energy, and remain constant to it in your spiritual practices, you would circumvent that and put your consciousness to better use without having to be sick and tired and broke. So to me that became, yes, I want to model that. That's what I want to do. And then the other issue of age, where people, particularly coming from a really more arduous life up in Canada, it's like at 50, some people were already, like acting as if the game was over. I'm tired. I farmed all my life, or I've worked hard and experienced losses and unhappiness, and we're calling the game over. I started to think I could model age, although it was always like, don't tell your age, let people be surprised. I bought into that. I thought, yeah, none of your business. Yeah. But then I thought that's a powerful lesson, to defy the myth of aging and deterioration and low energy.
Right.
So that's the way I see it. I've seen it as a stabilizing, and I've seen it as something that has really brought me into a love affair with what I know is with me. Just the things that I still, like a kid, I get excited, seeing the connecting of the dots, how the inner becomes the outer. And not about the effect, it's what it takes to bring the effect.
So you know, you love teaching,
Mm-hmm.
and are considered to be like, you know, great teacher, teacher's teacher. Who are your great students? You mentioned Heather Clark is one of them.
Heather Clark, okay, so some of the students tracing back to Edmonton, who actually, some for a period of time and others are still in the field. There was a young man from Edmonton named Ken Duncan, who went through all classes with me and in the ministerial class, and he indeed went on to open his own church at that time in a community outside of Edmonton called Camrose. He was a wonderful student. He had such an open, clear-thinking mind, very intellectual, very much analytical and in his head. And the thing that I'll always treasure is how I saw the head move down into the heart. I could tell by his hugs. You know, originally it was like, okay, I guess I got to do this. And then the warming, the thawing, the opening. And then the next thing I knew, one year, and occasionally through exercises, we do more creative, like write a poem, tell a story, tell a myth, give your right hemisphere part of yourself. As I would say on stage if I were talking, gotta get my chin. All of a sudden, without any preamble, Ken presents me, and I still have it, with a book. He was published as a poet in a Canadian book of poetry. So to me, he was the epitome. He loved Emma Curtis Hopkins, and we would, you know, exchange, have you seen this or seen that, from more remote teachers at that time. And then he only stayed doing that ministry for a couple of years, and then I did his installation, and that was it. Then he disappeared. He went into the printing business, but I'm sure he's still teaching science of mind in his own way. My God, if I come out of that, okay, so then there is to this day Reverend Tim Peterson, who is teaching in Edmonton, another part of Edmonton in addition to where Dr. Patrick is. Then there's Jerry Jesse Greziak, She's the third who's in Edmonton. She has a small center in Edmonton. There was a woman named Margaret Devine, Margaret Logue Devine. She started her work in another community in Edmonton, the outskirts, St. Albert. I did her installation. And then she had been ill for a long time. She made her transition. And I think they either dissolved that charter or they gave it up, maybe to Tim. I think maybe he took over that charter. So there were those, you know, coming to the States. I mean, the people that I trained as practitioners, Karen Oxrider, Brian Kiva, Diane and Stephen Brabant, who's a famous name, yourself. My God, you know, the list goes on and on. And when I taught fourth year, the ministerial here, when I returned to the States, I taught that class, we team taught for the first time. Dr. Dennis Merritt Jones and I did the 400 in the year. I think it was,
I remember.
yeah, 2000. So, I mean, that class, who went on from that class? Pam Gagan, Patrick Gagan, who made his transition 3 years ago.
I think Mike Morrill.
Who?
Mike McMorrill?
Michael took third year practitioner with me, but then he moved on because Dr. Maureen wasn't teaching. Who else was in that class? They didn't continue, I don't think. God, am I missing somebody really key? They'll kill me.
How about Janine or David Kidd?
Janine, no, they never took fourth year.
No.
Nope. Nope. No, that's it. I can't remember who. Must have been some from Dennis's neck of the woods. Oh, you know who was in that class? Reverend Linda Fisher took that teen taught class, and she's now in, where is she? In Tucson or somewhere in Arizona. So she was the only one.
What about Patrick Cameron? Was he in that class?
No.
No.
Nope.
He'd already gotten his
He had,
training.
yes, he had already come through, yeah. Yeah, I'll have to just have a picture of me waking up at 3 in the morning. Oh my God.
Well, we can always.
Yes, research.
Research.
That. Yeah.
Yes. So you were in Edmonton, and then you left Edmonton and did a temporary.
Yes, so I left
residency?
Edmonton, we had the building, there were people out in the field. I didn't take a conscious, direct act to leave, so I found myself broadsided and in the hospital. Subconscious took care of it for me and said, I think you really need to go. So I came back in 95, late 95, when I was better. So you see, I did have to demonstrate something dramatic, and as it turned out. And then came home and thought, what do I do now? I did something very foolish. In the interim, I had candidated somewhere else and then backed out. So Frank White, who is, to the best of my knowledge, still alive and well in Honolulu, was having some severe health challenges at the time. And he said, why don't you come and do my ministry for me for a couple of months? Okay, I'll do that. So I went to Honolulu, probably in February, and stayed 3 months there until Frank got back on his feet. And then I had already spoken at Westlake. They knew me and were starting to woo me because they were without a minister by this time. And so Stephen Brabant started his campaign. He would start calling me in Honolulu. And I came back because when I left the final Sunday in Honolulu, when the kids all gathered around and Frank, bless his heart, came up on the stage, I thought, what are you doing here? This is my turf. I already had that sense of ownership. I've got to be a part of something. This little Flitton isn't going to hack it. So they asked me to candidate for Westlake, and I ran into a couple of stumbling blocks because they had only one other candidate, as it turned out. If they had others, they dropped off. But they felt I had an unfair advantage, having been there already. So a couple of my buddies got on my case, like, you have to have an interview with us. So I did. It was okay. So I candidated and was selected. And that picture somewhere up there of my whole family, that was my installation in 1996, June 23rd. Yep.
So you were
So-
candidating in Westlake.
A candidate at Westlake was selected and installed in June 23rd, 1996. And it felt more solid than I had when I went to Edmonton, obviously. And so we started rolling. They had had an enormous fallout. And I'll always take this remembrance to heart, that the reason that I was able to so eagerly do whatever I did in those early days, because I was not attached. I don't think at that point I had an agreement or a contract. It was kind of an open-ended, I'm here, but I'm not going to tell you I'm going to be here for 3 years or 4 years or whatever. And I was detached. They were very attached because they had been drawing on their reserves. Money was in short supply. People had vanished out of what had occurred to create the vacancy. And I was like, so what? And they kept saying, we're only operating with enough money for 6 months, otherwise the doors have to shut. And you know, the way that I was coming free and easy and confident was like, no, that's not going to happen. And obviously it didn't. So we kept building. People, another lesson, there were some people who insisted, let's call everybody who left and tell them it's a new day. And my feeling was, you can't go chasing a past that has already completed itself. Let's start where we are. Because whatever this is going to be, it's a manifestation of my consciousness, your consciousness, working collectively towards something new. So we did well. We got a lot of coverage those years in the Ventura County Star. We were very effective at letting them know. They were very kind and interested at what this Jewish woman who had been up in Canada was doing, you know, in a religious science church that was teaching science and what was that about. Did some radio interviews. Yeah, it was an active, busy time where the 30 or 40 became the 50 and 60, and people started showing interest, and it was fun, it was exciting. Then the desire to move from where they were started, the move from the townsgate. We had been looking for a building, but that just was not materializing, but we thought we could change location. And so a very eager group of very dedicated members embarked on the search, and they found the current facility. And this is true confession. I thought that's a lot of money for something that isn't all that functional when you think about where people are going to convene. The floor may be there. It's pretty, it's nice, and we'll make of it something wonderful. And I think I bought into the sometime illusionary Westlake mindset. We can do this. Look at us. We dress well, we look good, and we have lots of charge cards, and we'll make it happen. So the move was on, and before you know it, we opened, and it's never quite like you imagine, because the concept always is, this will be enormous, gigantic. That exponential leap from 100 people to 200 will be immediate. Not so. And so, God, that was like, maybe, how long was that building? You've been there like
10 years, right?
close to 7 or 8 years. And so, but you know, we kept going. New practitioners came through the ranks, And there was growth. There was growth in people's lives, you know, and in the ways that you could feel. But I don't know about anybody else really, but I know I was growing and experiencing my kids growing up, and suddenly they're having kids and I'm a grandma. And just a whole shift in perspective that's represented, that same feeling of, I think I'm coming into conclusion here. By the time I was there, like 10, 11 years, we celebrated my 70th birthday. We celebrated the 40th anniversary of the center. That was its 40th year. I always remember we called it a 40-year adventure in faith. And we had lots of wonderful celebrations. And yet, whether it was talking to the ministers in Simi or in Camarillo or in Westlake, we used to have, years ago, we had what we called the 8 Great. We used to meet in Camarillo, where Reverend Cynthia Clare was at that time.
Right.
The 8 Science of Mind teaching centers that existed. And that's when Patrick Cameron was still in Fillmore, and Marilyn Miller was up in Ventura, and Dennis and myself and all of us. We were the 8 Great, and we would meet for nourishment. Let us breathe deeply into the silence. Catherine Yates. Did you know that?
Yes.
Oh, she was a
I
beautiful
remember
teacher.
her.
Yeah, she passed away. And the other gal from Ventura, Paula Swavely.
Mm-hmm.
And who else was from the other teaching center in Camarillo? I don't think Grace, this was before Grace Lovejoy's time. So that was it. It was a reinforcement for what we did. The one thing we did one year, we did a world peace meditation that had been going on New Year's Eve morning. We did that. We put that together as a joint effort, rented some space in between. And that was the only thing. Then, again, attrition set in, we all dissolved. That.
Were you involved with RSI or one of the INTA or any of the larger organizations? Can you tell us a
I
little bit about
served
that?
on the RSI board when the last year that I was in Canada, last year or two. And I remember Don Burt, that was also his first year. James Golden, he had to be the president then.
Yeah.
And so I was on a committee. I headed up a committee with James and Don Burt and myself, and it was to revamp ceremonies. I don't know whatever happened to them. We put together magnificent new things. They never saw the light of day. But it gave me my first taste of the bigger board of directors, which was great. You know, in the olden days, it was pretty much the old boys group and the hierarchy of the patriarchal leadership. And I always remember the first woman that I ever spoke to that was before me on the board, Reverend Helen Street. Oh my God, she was a powerhouse. And how she took a lot of, from her perspective, I never heard it from anyone else as much as from her, a lot of hurt, you know, about disregarding seemingly of the feminine contribution, you know, of creativity and compassion. And so, but we were great. We were a working board, and we did what we came to do, and that was that. The only other organization, I had been attending INTA, but I was at that meeting when it all imploded, and the group that subsequently became Agent,
Yeah.
that was originally INTA, that was Michael Beckwith, and that was the Mary Onway and all of them from that group who just felt that INTA wasn't global enough, expansive enough, or visionary enough to do what they wanted to do. So there was a meeting at which they just all we decided to leave and formulate this new organization, which became the Association for Global New Thought. So I was on, not their leadership, they had their primary leadership with Michael and Mary Morrissey at that time and many others, Howard Caesar, but they had a larger group called the Advisory Council. So I was on their Advisory Council, and we would meet when they would meet up in Santa Barbara usually, and I'll never forget, it was the time that Mary Mann Morrissey at the time had run into her difficulty, and we had this first meeting after she was no longer there, and yet the meeting got underway. Nobody was mentioning. It was like she had suddenly never existed.
Was she at this meeting?
No, she was not at the meeting.
Oh.
She was gone, and nobody said boo. So toward the end of the day, it's kind of reminiscent, sidebar, of the way when we would attend Congress, I suddenly became this self-appointed person to get up and do a treatment when things became non-negotiable, argumentative, confrontive, and nasty. I would just kind of rise from that same go to Edmonton place and just do a treatment and sit down. So I kind of created, people looking at me sometimes like now would be a good time. So that was that same feeling. So before we were getting all ready to wrap it up, I went, so what about Mary? Aren't we going to do a prayer or something? Or what's going on? Have we all suddenly agreed without our agreement to disown her? What's that about? And there was embarrassment and, oh yeah. So I think Michael led a treatment or something. But it's that same, like, the feeling. You have it in your own life where you're moving without having a clue where you're moving to, but you do know that it's the perfect direction. So yeah, that was good. I like the Advisory Council. And they're having a film festival, in fact, up in Santa Barbara.
It's coming up.
Yeah. So.
And what about your involvement with the local interfaith ecumenical organization? You've been involved with that as well? Yeah, for a long, long time. I can't even think who suggested or how I found out. Just found out there was an interfaith ministerial association, and they were having their meetings periodically, once a month on a Tuesday, and the neighboring participants would be host. So I went, and I think at that time, I may have been the only woman. They were all they would in fact come to lunch, a lot of the fathers, the priests with their garb, and it was like, okay, who else is there anyone from Unity? Not yet. There was Unitarian, oh yeah, there was Betty from the Universal Unitarian. She had been there for years. There was the wonderful rabbi right here from Temple Adat Elohim at that time. And then a lot of the Catholic churches, the varying Mormons, the Latter-day Saints started coming in. And then gradually, all of a sudden, there was a gal representing the Baha'i, and then Unity. At that time, the minister, that was not Molly, that was before her time. Unity, and so started changing the picture. And we would meet every month just to support each other and share where we were at. The person who was hosting had the floor to describe their teaching. So whenever it was at Westlake, that's exactly what I did. And then every year, the one thing we came together doing was an interfaith Thanksgiving Eve service. And in the early days, we were given the script because it was so predominantly already worked out. And most of it was like that responsive reading to what someone else had suggested. And then gradually, the Unity minister and myself and the Unitarian said, well, what would it be like if we each were more representative of who we each are?
And so we did that, and you always had to pass it through, but you
Yes.
weren't going to burn animals or do something. And so it's become really a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, which I'm
You're
still
still
doing. Yeah, still participating. So, yeah, there was a big representation from Science of Mind, because originally Westlake did their own, or Dr. Marine did her own Thanksgiving Eve service, but then she shifted. So last year there was her, and there was Michael DeFebo participated. He was then staff minister. Of course, there's another minister, Michael DeFebo, who was with me for 3 years, and then went on. Babs DeFebo was with me for 3 years. So there were, yeah, nice representation from everyone really bringing their own sweet, savory part of what they love to do.
So, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, was Reverend Harriet Foster a student of yours?
Oh my God, no, she wasn't. Harriet Foster, our beloved staff minister, who we just all adored. I'm not going to cry right now, just... Anyway, she was a student originally at Bitzer's, and then in New York, of Stuart Grayson, and then ultimately ended up as staff minister to Frank Richelieu in Redondo. And here she lived in Calabasas and would travel, because she was at Redondo every day serving. And then somebody told her, did you know there's a church of religious science in Westlake? And I was teaching a Science of Mind Day class, and all of a sudden, one day, this blonde bombshell paraded in, sat down, and it turned out she was staff minister, Reverend Harriet Foster. And so we started talking, and she said, "Do you need a staff minister?" And I went, "I sure do, and you're it." So she shifted and became our staff minister.
Yeah.
Great
She was
woman.
wonderful.
Oh, great teacher of truth and demonstrator of it. Yeah.
So what, now that, you know, you've had this very long, illustrious career as a minister and teacher, and you've transitioned now from being a pulpit minister, and you have now a different kind of ministry. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now that you're no longer a pulpit minister?
Certainly, yeah. So the years started, as I said before, winding up, and by the 13th year that I had been at Westlake, I realized it's time. It was no longer a thrill to be figuring out what we were going to be doing the next year, and what plan and what classes were orchestrated, and how are we going to do this, because like everybody else, we had our deficit months, and that started happening. So I thought, no, let me step aside. There's room for something new to occur here. So I left after 13 years. That was 5 years ago. That was in 2009. And I have to put this in because it's so symbolic. I started, my first official before licensing Sunday at Westlake was on Easter Sunday. The next auspicious Easter was when your beloved Dr. Jim Lockard was my co-pastor. In this mix, Jim and I became co-pastors for about 3 years. And it was 2008, and we had planned this wonderful Easter service together. And I got the call 7 o'clock that morning of what had happened. Jim's daughter had been killed. And then it was on Easter that was my last day too. So Easter, that resurrected consciousness, is pretty symbolic. So I left, and I thought, well, obviously my ministry continues, and it's going to take different shape. And I just I did the treatment that said how grateful I was for everything that had led me to this point, and now new ways of teaching, of mentoring, of speaking, of serving would be amply provided, because that was my dream, my vision, my intention, and my acceptance of that. And that's what happened. I had somebody create for me a website so people, at least I could show a card and say, you know, if you want somebody. But I never humanly pushed or forced to make anything happen. because I have met and loved so many people, and I guess they kind of liked me too, just started. I think the very first place that I spoke was Granada Hills, and then Simi, and just, it snowballed. You know, can you come and teach? How about teaching a class besides that? And I started teaching. By that time, Reverend Pam Gagan was the minister in Camarillo. And after Patrick passed away, she said, do you think you would like to just do one Sunday a month with us? It'll give you a base, and it would be great. So I am there, blessedly. And in between, it's just been remarkable. I am mentoring on behalf of Centers for Spiritual Living. I mentored the young man who started a work in Shanghai, Robert Applegate.
Wonderful.
Mentored him for a year. And now I'm mentoring a young woman, Reverend Barbara Butler, who has returned with a provisional licensing because she was administered years ago in religious science, left and now is coming back in, but she's not quite sure where or how she wants to do that. So I'm mentoring her, and I'm mentoring a practitioner who took the practitioner training online, but because it was online, she never had a taste of a lot of client practitioner training.
Right.
So she was passed by her with her orals and all the preliminaries, but they suggested she mentor with someone just in terms of client practitioner. So Charles Geddes and was one of her interviewers, and Bob Luckin and Judith Churchman. And so they said, call Sue Rubin. So that's what we're doing. She's giving me a case history, and then we, by phone, communicate, and we'll just do that until she feels solid. So, yeah, so I'm still active in that part. But basically, my caveat is, Sue, your mind, your spirit, your soul, is its ripest and richest it's ever been. But you can't drag the body around to the degree you think you can, because I get tired sometimes. And to make that confession to myself and for all humanity to see, it's like, okay, so I'm now practicing the fine art of spiritual discernment, that I don't have to say yes to everything. I do a lot in my own private mentoring, counseling practice, and so board retreats. I did one at Simi for practitioners, and this most recent one down in San Clemente for their board. So it's as much as I want it to be, and I am interested in getting back to dancing. There's my emerald. See that emerald? That was my winning
Okay.
competition in ballroom dancing after I left Westlake.
So you're just still doing some dancing?
No, because all of this other has,
You've been
again,
busy.
it's become the ministry, just like when I was in ministry. That was it. Kids, I'll be around tomorrow, ministry. Same thing, dancing, I'll be back to you later. Well, later is now, Sue Rubin.
Good.
So, yeah.
And just tell us about your spiritual practice that you're doing currently. Just a little bit about that would be helpful.
So you would probably giggle if I brought you upstairs and showed you my night table. Yay big. So I generally like to find something that is a study approach, something. And this started right before Easter, when I thought I want to engage in some 40-day Lenten practice. So I pulled out one of my books on Charles Fillmore's Lenten something. And sure enough, he had 40 days of spiritual practice with the commentary for that each day, as well as the affirmation, as they would call it, for the day. So I went through that as a practice. And then currently, I had never been through the journey, what's that book, by Mark Nepo? The Journey, it's not Journey of Awakening, it's the Awakening book, where he
Okay.
has for every day, and lots of exercises. I went back to journaling. I did that when I was in the hospital this past December, and I was talking to my son and saying, days are so fucking long. I mean, I'm not used to being awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning, and here it is, my God, it's only 8 a.m. And so my son looked at me and said, Mom, this is just to be considered a long meditation. And he said, I'm bringing you a journal so you can vent your thoughts. And sure enough, that journal, to me, it's like, if you're going to write a book, just think long meditation. And there it is. So I've been journaling ever since December. So that's part of the practice in this journey of awakening, which elicits very nice questions. I first of all meditate after I go to the bathroom. And so that can be anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, whatever it takes. And the interesting thing is, Dorianne, I'll still weave the mantra from transcendental meditation. If I feel I'm wandering too far off or not breathing in harmony, I'll come back and that mantra just kicks right in, and it's my anchor. So after meditating, then I go to my little pile, which is creative thought.
Which will be no
I
longer
know,
shortly.
I
Yes.
know. If I happen to, I think they sometimes just send me daily word if that's there, and then I'm correcting their statements. I'm always like making little tweaks in daily word. And then I've got Science of Mind magazine for the day. I have kept a huge supply of October Science of Minds. You know why? Because every October, the daily meditations are Ernest Holmes. And so I just love those things where he'll give the quote, usually from the Bible, and then his little commentary, and then his long treatment. So I currently, I think, October 1991. But the fascinating thing is that one, whichever year it is, it coincides. The day and the date are the same,
Interesting.
only the month is different. So it's like, what a trip. He meant for me to pick it up this trip. So I've got that. I've got an incredible book by Irvin Seal, a little tiny black book, at least my copy is, on the Lord's Prayer, where it just metaphysically is just remarkable in its particular interpretation. And so some things I just ponder because they just open such a different, deeper door within me. So I study my little black book, and then I've got a fabulous little notebook, just big, maybe 20 pages, that Fenwick Holmes wrote, and it's called On Being and Becoming.
I've heard that.
Oh my God, where he just traces the invisible becoming the visible, that whole process. So I've got those. I think that's enough. And then the journaling. So that's it. By now, easily an hour and a half, 2 hours, so it's like, oh dear, time she
Time for
marches
coffee.
on. Yeah, right, exactly.
Coffee break.
And food, some breakfast.
Well, I have just one final question for you, and what words of wisdom would you like to leave with the archives, as something that you would like everyone in the Science of Mind teaching to know from you, from your heart? What are the words of wisdom that you would like us to know?
So, if I were being probably more succinct than I've ever been before, you know what I would say? It's like it's on a big inscription. It says, God is, I am, exclamation point, and then, got it? It would say, get it. Got it?
Good.
That's it. Because, I mean, to me, that's been my mantra, really my mantra for a long time. The other thing that somewhere is important in there, when I went to Canada, and that was really the only center, the Calgary Religious Science Church at that time, Dr. Arlene was there at that time. But what evolved in British Columbia and in Red Deer, another minister that was in my ministerial class in Edmonton was Reverend Doug Craig from Calgary. He was the minister. Another one I forgot, she was my staff minister originally, Reverend Valentine Owen from Red Deer, who took on that ministry. And I became the sponsor on behalf of RSI for everybody in Canada. It was remarkable. Lloyd Klein, who was a minister at some point, he was Arlene's student, and a gal named Darlene Schneider, who was in Vancouver, Kim Farrell, who had been in Saskatoon. And it was like I was constantly busy. I was on the phone with these new kids on the block, and it was fabulous. It was great.
Wonderful.
So, there you
Well,
have it.
God is, I am.
Get it? Got it? Good!
Thank you so much, Dr. Sue.
Oh, this has been just a treat.
a treasure for us.